So today we are here and very excited to hear from award-winning scientist Solène Derville about her work on humpback whales in the South Pacific. And what Solène's going to share is really interesting because quite a lot is known about humpbacks when they're nearer to the shore, but Solène's research focuses on humpbacks when they're further offshore and especially when they're around seamounts. And many of you on the call today will have been involved in our campaigns over the last year or so to protect seamounts. So while Solène is presenting, if you have any questions for her, you can pop them into the chat box. And if you look in the middle of your tools at the bottom of the Zoom, you'll see you have a little chat icon and you can click on that. It'll open a box and you can type your questions in. And after the presentation, Solène will answer as many of the questions as we can. If we don't get around to answering your question, don't fear. We will follow up with an email after the event to any questions that didn't get answered to share the answers. And if you have any technical problems during the course of the event, please let us know in the chat, and Erin from the Greenpeace team will be able to jump in and help you. I think that's all. Okay, so without any further ado then, let me hand over to Solène Derville. Solène, you can take it away.
Okay, so I unmuted myself. Now I will share my screen. All right, is that working?
Yes.
I get confirmation. Thank you. Okay, wonderful. I have to say that I've never participated in a conference like that in the past, and it's quite amazing to see everyone connected and share this research with you from New Caledonia. So I hope you'll enjoy the talk. Today I will be presenting the research that has been conducted by our team in New Caledonia and trying to tell you everything that we've learned on humpback whales and seamounts. All right, so before I start, I'll just quickly introduce myself so that you actually know who is talking on the other side of the computer. I'm originally from France and I moved to New Caledonia here in the Pacific in 2015 to conduct a PhD on the spatial ecology of humpback whales in the South Pacific. I defended my PhD in 2019, and since then I've kept working at the French Research Institute for Sustainable Research, where I've focused my work on seamounts. So during all this time, I was supervised by Dr. Claire Garrigue, who's on the right here. She's a marine mammal expert, and she's been working on whales, dugong, dolphins in New Caledonia since 1993. So I would really like to acknowledge that a lot of the things that I'm going to show you today are actually her work. Now, first, who are these humpback whales that I'm going to talk about for about 20 minutes? Humpbacks are one out of many whale species around the globe. Their Latin name is Megaptera novae angliae, which means the large wings. So these whales can easily be recognized at sea because of these very long pectoral fins that you can see on this picture. And in addition, humpback whales are called that way in English because of the way they arch their back when they dive, which really creates a sort of big dark hump at the surface of the water. Humpback whales are migratory species. In fact, they are the mammals with the longest migration in the world. Every year they migrate from the tropics to the poles and back. So they spend the winter mating and calving in warm tropical waters, such as New Caledonia, and they spend the summer feeding in polar waters where their favorite prey can be found. So in Antarctica, humpback whales feed on a tiny sort of shrimp. There's a picture here, which is called the krill, and this krill grows in great number in the summer when the ice starts melting. Alors, humpback whales are found worldwide, but they form distinct populations. So the whales from the northern hemisphere never actually meet those from the southern hemisphere. And within each, they also regroup in distinct populations, which are represented on this map. So the whales move every year between the breeding grounds, represented with the red circles, and feeding grounds, represented with green circles. And they rarely meet with the neighboring populations. So now let's focus on the Oceania population, which is quite peculiar because contrary to other populations that meet on continental shelves, the Oceania population is spread over several archipelagos, which are dispersed over the vast South Pacific Ocean. So this population forms several separate subpopulations, meaning that the whales going to New Caledonia, Tonga, French Polynesia are actually not the same ones. That's important to understand. However, they might meet along migratory corridors such as Norfolk, the Kermadec, or New Zealand. They feed in a vast region, roughly located between the Ross Sea and the Balleny Islands. Finally, Oceania humpback whales have been particularly decimated by industrial whaling in the 20th century, and they're now one of the only populations to still be classified as endangered in the IUCN Red Lists. So there's a real conservation issue here for humpback whales for Pacific Islanders. So during the breeding season, humpback whales are known to occupy coastal habitats. This has been shown in many breeding sites around the world. And in New Caledonia, they've been studied near shore in the South Lagoon since 1995. This long-term monitoring program has been led by a local NGO, Opération Cétacé, and is still ongoing today. So thanks to all this research efforts, we've gained quite a good understanding of humpback whale behavior and habitat use in coastal areas, but we barely know what whales do when they're offshore. And that's what I'm going to tell you about in the rest of this talk. So our scientific adventure started in 2007 when Claire deployed the first satellite tags on whales in New Caledonia. So at the time, the tagging was actually funded by Greenpeace International because the goal of this tagging was to know where Oceania whales fed in Antarctica and whether this endangered population could be impacted by Japanese whalers down there. So they deployed implanted tags at the end of the breeding season, and they expected whales to nicely move on for their southern migration. And of course, this is not what happened, as science never goes as planned. So instead of quickly moving south, almost all whales stopped over what seemed to be the middle of nowhere. So on the left, the red crosses on the map show you all the whale positions recorded by satellites. And as you can see, many of these red crosses concentrate in an area about 100 kilometers south of New Caledonia. This area coincides with the so-called Antigonia seamount. Now, I think the definition of seamounts is well overdue at this stage of the talk. So a seamount is an undersea mountain that rises from the bottom of the ocean, but without reaching the surface. There are thousands of them around the globe and specifically in the Pacific. Antigonia is a relatively small seamount with a summit at about 60 meters deep and a surrounding depth of 1,000 to 1,500 meters. You can see that on the 3D map on the right. But Antigonia has a peculiar shape called guillo shape, meaning that it has a completely flat summit, like a little plateau, on top of which whales seem to spend quite some time. Now, why was it surprising at the time to observe an association between seamounts and humpbacks? you have to understand that back in 2007, this was really the first direct evidence for seamount use by humpback whales during the breeding season. So this contradicted the paradigm that humpback whales, and specifically mothers, seek sheltered coastal waters when nursing their newborn calf. So the picture to the top here was taken in French Polynesia, and it really illustrates what a typical breeding ground should look like for humpback whales. Calm lagoon, sheltered waters where whales can avoid predators and where females can, mothers with calf can avoid males. And this really contrasts with seamount condition, which look more like the bottom picture, with very rough seas, high-speed winds, and big swell. So the year after this first tagging, in 2008, Claire Garrigue decided to go and see with her own eyes what was going on in Antigonia's seamounts. Because of the rough weathers that they encountered offshore, Claire and her team only surveyed the seamounts for a few days, but they discovered what looked like a major breeding site. The number of whales that they observed in a day was approximately what we observed in a week in the South Lagoon, in the coastal breeding ground. Since then, we've conducted more than a dozen research surveys over Antigonia seamounts, but also over other seamounts around New Caledonia. And we deployed more than 60 satellite tags to follow whale movements, including 18 satellite tags with depth recorders, which recently allowed us to look at the vertical behavior of whales in addition to their movements. Now, from all this research, what have we learned? First, we've learned that humpback whales regroup in great numbers around seamounts. So during my PhD, I conducted a study at Oceania scale, thanks to all of our collaborators in the region. I put together more than 1,300 days of surveys that had been conducted in Oceania. And I calculated what is called an encounter rate, which is basically the number of whales that we observe from our boats per hour of research efforts. So it's a proxy, an approximation of the density of whales in an area. This map was published in 2019, and it shows the average encounter rates in cells of 1 degree of longitude by 1 degree of latitude. And what strikes us straight away when we look at this map is that there are only 2 orange cells indicating the highest concentration of whales. And these 2 cells are located over the Antigonia Seamounts and Humpback in New Caledonia. So this result really highlighted the exceptional aggregations that occur over seamounts at Oceania scale. Now, secondly, we've learned that seamounts may be used as breeding sites by humpback whales. At least this is the case for those that we were able to visit with our research vessel. So while being at sea on these seamounts, we observed many males competing for females. We observed many mothers with calves, and we heard a lot of songs. Now, these songs are only produced by males and only produced during the breeding season because they're a typical breeding behavior. And in 2017, we deployed a hydrophone on Antigonia Seamount for about 2 months. And we basically had constant singing all day, all night long on this recording for about 2 months. So this really revealed how intense the breeding behaviors are on this, in this habitat. So in addition to being breeding sites, seamounts may also be stepping stones and connect subpopulations together. This map shows all the satellite tracks from whales tagged in New Caledonia. And you can see that not only did whales stop over seamounts in New Caledonian waters, they also stopped over the Norfolk Ridge, which connects New Caledonia with New Zealand. And they also stopped over the Lord Howe Seamount chain, which is located halfway between New Caledonia and Australia. So there's two very important seamounts there, Capel and Kelso, which we've never actually visited with a research vessel because of how isolated, how far they are, but we're hoping to do that someday. And the few whales that crossed the Coral Sea from New Caledonia to Australia spent several days over these seamounts. So in addition to being breeding sites, seamounts seem to play a role in structuring movements at a wide South Pacific scale. And this, of course, has great consequences in terms of population dynamics and understanding exchanges between population in the Pacific Southwest. Finally, thanks to the latest tracking technology, we were able to discover unexpected deep diving behavior around seamounts and in offshore waters in general. So the plot here shows the successive dives of a whale through time. Each of the little bars, vertical bar, is a dive recorded by the tag, and each of the red bar is a dive that exceeded 80 meters deep. So you can see that there are quite a few of those deep dives, and they most often occurred in series. So quite interestingly, among our 18 tags, we recorded a record-breaking dive at 616 meters, which is about 200 meters more than what was previously reported in the literature. So these deep dives, as I said, tend to occur in series, but whales also seem to spend quite a lot of time at the bottom of these deep dives. So the figure here is showing the dive profile of a whale during 2 hours, and you can see that it progressively dove deeper and deeper, reaching a depth of more than 300 meters. And spending more than 5 minutes at the bottom of that dive. So as we recurrently observe this deep diving behavior, we wondered why would whales waste their precious energy stores to dive that deep and spend so much time at depth? I do not actually have the answer to that question. This is an ongoing mystery that we're working on at the moment. But we proposed 3 hypotheses to explain this deep diving behavior. The first one is the social hypothesis, as we think that during competitive interactions between males competing for a female, whales might be diving at depth, just trying to chase each other, and females trying to escape from males. So that's a possibility. Second, the scouting hypothesis would be that whales might be diving at depth to try to gain some cues on oceanographic currents or hear certain sounds that might help them navigate from one breeding ground to the other. And finally, the feeding hypothesis is a tricky one because technically whales are not supposed to feed when they're in tropical waters. They do not find enough prey, they do not find enough krill to feed. But the dives that we observed really have the characteristics of feeding dives. So it is possible that these deep dives give the opportunity for whales to take a little snack. In addition, we know that seamounts can be very productive habitats where there might be some opportunities like more prey for whales to feed on. So that's something that we're currently working on to try to understand whether or not whales might be opportunistically feeding over seamounts in tropical waters. Now, how is all this research going to help protect our ocean? How is all this going back to conservation? In addition to concentrating humpback whales, seamounts can be hotspots of biodiversity and biomass for many other marine organisms. In a nutshell, the topography of the seafloor influences water circulation, and isolated seabed features such as seamounts affect vertical mixing of the water and create turbulences. And these turbulences may occur on the slopes of the seamounts, and they may bring nutrients up towards the surface into what is called the euphotic zone, where light is available. So now, I think you all know what happens when there is light and there's nutrients, there's usually life. So consequently, and due to their geographic isolation, seamounts are thought to be exceptional but vulnerable ecosystems. So although seamounts used to be pretty much unexplored because of how deep, how isolated they may be, they're now progressively becoming the focus of interest for human activities such as industrial fishing and mining. And sadly, these activities are threatening these fragile ecosystems. So as we are communicating all of our findings to stakeholders in New Caledonia, we're now hoping that humpback whales can play the role of umbrella species of conservation, meaning that their protection can benefit to the entire ecosystem they live in. In New Caledonia, the government has committed to protect seamounts from harmful human activities, thanks to marine protected areas, which should be put in place in the coming years. And we hope, and we're quite certain now, that whales will be at the center of these decisions. Okay, so with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'll take questions if there are any.
Thank you so much for that, Solène. That was so excellent and a really great window into the world of humpback whales. And one thing that really struck me was how new so much of this information is, and how much we're kind of still learning about marine life and their ecosystems and how they function together. So if you do have questions for Solène, pop them into the chat box, but we've had a few come through, so I will ask those of you now, and if more come up, you can pop them in as we go. So the first question for you, Solène, from Michael is, can you please briefly summarize your recent work on the likely impacts of climate change on the Pacific Island whales?
All right, yes. So this work on climate change is related to the map I showed at Oceania scale. So this work has been done as a collaboration with many other scientists in Oceania who have been collecting data in different archipelagos, so Tonga, Samoa, French Polynesia, and so on. So in this publication, what we did is that we looked at encounter rates and just trying to gain an understanding of the density of whales and the habitats that they use in Oceania in different archipelagos, and try to understand how does temperature affect their distribution through time, because we had 19 years of data there, and throughout these 19 years temperature has fluctuated. You all know about the ENSO phenomenon with El Nino and La Nina years, which result in warm or cold waters. So the idea was to try to understand how whale presence is affected by temperature, and if it is affected by temperature, what is the current range that they use, and how is this range going to evolve in the future. So I think one of the main takeaway message from this study was that the whales in Oceania use a range roughly located between 21 and 28 degrees for the surface temperature water, sorry, the temperature of this at the surface. And we predicted where this range of temperature would be at the end of the century. And we discovered that a lot of the current breeding grounds will be in very warm waters by the end of the century, far above 28 degrees, which means that places like the Samoa, American Samoa, or Tonga, or the Society Islands in French Polynesia, which are currently occupied every year by a lot of whales, might be too warm for them at the end of the century. The question that remains is whether this is going to be a problem, whether this is going to affect mating, calving of whales. And if it does affect them, will they be able to move in response to this increase in water temperature? Because of course, there are many other breeding sites further south that will remain in suitable temperatures, but we do not know if the whales will be capable to move, to shift their distribution to these places.
Thank you. A question from Michelle is, do you know if the seamounts and the behaviour of the humpback whales that we see in Oceania is mirrored in the Northern Hemisphere?
So I think now that many people around the world are using satellite tags, and these tags are getting better and better at staying long on whales, for instance, we are able to see what whales do when they're offshore. And I mean, I think certainly whales use seamounts elsewhere around the world. It's just a matter of finding these places that they use. I mean, around Hawaii, certainly there are seamounts that whales tend to use. This has been shown with recordings. We've heard some scientists have heard songs on seamounts north of Hawaii, and we've seen whales stopping over seamounts in other oceans around the world. Yes.
Cool. Karen would like to know how you're going to verify your hypotheses, and I think that's probably the hypotheses to do with the deep diving and why that's happening.
Yeah, so this is really tricky. I think for the feeding hypothesis, it is, I mean, until we actually see a whale feeding, we can't tell if they are. And to see a whale feeding at depth is really difficult, of course. One possible method that we could use to observe this feeding would be to deploy another sort of tags, not the implanted ones, but some that you stick on the back of the whale and that you have to retrieve a few hours later. But these tags, they can measure acceleration, they can measure movements through the water column much more precisely than what I showed you. And hopefully with this sort of tag, we could detect feeding lunges at depth. But for now, what we've been doing, we haven't had access to such tags. So what we've been doing is that we've collaborated with other team, with oceanographers and people who work on prey, who work on the micronectin, so all of these little fish and crustaceans. And we're trying to look at the density and the composition of prey around seamounts to see if there is actually some potential for feeding.
Interesting. You'll have to come back and give us another talk once you've done more of that. So a question from Sarah, of the 18 whales that have been tagged and tracked, have you named them?
Oh yeah, we name whales for sure. I don't think I remember all of their names, but we try to have themes every year. I think my favorite one was, there was a year where we named them, there was a Zealandia that went to New Zealand, and Oceania, and all sorts of names like this, but I'm afraid I forget their names.
It's quite all right. So Nicole would like to know, on a practical level, can you explain how deep sea fishing and some of the threats that you mentioned to the seamounts are negatively impacting them?
So Actually, in New Caledonia, we're quite fortunate that there is a little bit of fishing of certain deep sea fishes, but it's a very, how would you say, very small fisheries that are not harmful for, certainly not harmful for whales, because I think what is harmful in other places around the world is the bottom trawling, because this would, well, I mean, not necessarily for whales, but as I said, there are many other organisms that live on these seamounts, and I think most specifically a lot of benthic species, so all of these corals or sponges that live at the bottom, on the top of the seamount, on the summit or on the slopes. These are usually very slow growing organisms, very fragile, and of course bottom trawling mechanically destroys this life that has taken hundreds of years to form.
Yeah, I think a few people on the call know a bit about bottom trawling and some of the risks that we see.
Probably more than I do, actually.
No, but you know, it's definitely concerning. So next question, Greg would like to know if all of the significant seamounts in the South Pacific are charted.
All right, that's a really good question, because actually working on seamounts, my main nightmare has been to simply map them and know where they are, what their height is, because the answer to that question is that no, they're not all charted, they're not all mapped, or at least for a lot of them, we know that we know their position, we know there's a seamount in a certain place, but there is a lot of uncertainty on how big or how high it is. And that's a problem because in the case of humpback whales, we've determined that the depth of the summit of the seamount is very important for humpback whales. This is really what determines whether a seamount is suitable for them or not. And this limit in depth seems to be around 100 to 100 meters. So all seamounts that are deeper than that are probably not as suitable for whales, but sometimes it's hard to determine whether a seamount is at this height or not.
Yeah, I was looking at some stuff the other day about, I think in the New Zealand EEZ, they think there's around 800 seamounts, but so few of them have, you know, any kind of study about what's there. And
yeah, it's also tricky to count them. That's why I said there's thousands of them around the world, because depending on how you define them, right, in terms of height, in terms of shape, of size, then something might be a seamount, it might be considered just like a hill, or, you know, so depending on the classifications, you'll get very, very different numbers.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, we've got time for a few more questions, so get them into the chat. But so question, it's a nice one, a question from Lucy. Have you ever been diving with the whales, and how close did you get to them?
Answer to that question, it happened to me only once to free dive with whales, but not in New Caledonia. It was an amazing experience. But I guess for our work, we do not need to go underwater with them. This would actually be, yeah, it would be pretty useless, and it would probably do more harm than anything else, as we're really trying to affect whales the least when we approach them. We take pictures, we take biopsy samples using crossbows, and so we aim for our approach to be as short as possible.
Always the dream, isn't it, to be able to go close to these animals, but actually we should probably just leave them be. Lucia would like to ask, could you say that as the water gets warmer, we will see more humpbacks or other tropical whales moving towards more temperate waters, maybe in New Zealand, to perform mating and nursing?
Well, we shall see. I think that was the conclusion of our work on climate change and how it may affect whales. We're capable to say that the temperature is going to rise and that it's going to rise in a way that it might make some waters unsuitable for them, but we're quite incapable to say whether whales will move. It seems like in the past, we had examples of whales moving, shifting their distribution in response to a change in their environments. So yeah, possibly they seem to be plastic enough in their behavior to be able to shift their distribution by a few hundred kilometers. I mean, I guess it would be very interesting to see in the coming years whether there is more breeding activity going on the migratory corridors. So places like Norfolk, New Zealand, the Kermadec. Yeah, see if the calves are younger, if there's more, if we hear songs, if we see competitive interactions between animals. That would be very interesting. But I think this also highlights the value of long-term monitoring, because to detect that sort of change in the behavior within the population, it is essential to have long-term data, to have been recording behavior in an area over many, many years. And that's the sort of data that we often lack.
Jessie would like to know, was there a specific event that inspired you to start your research on humpback whales?
Sorry, can you repeat?
So Jessie would like to know, was there a specific event that inspired you to start this research on humpback whales?
Actually, yeah, no, not necessarily. I've worked, before I did my PhD on whales, I worked a little bit on other marine species, such as sea turtles or the Maui dolphin in New Zealand. And I found a lot of interest in studying these highly social, intelligent animals. But I was just very lucky, basically, to meet with Claire Garrigue in New Caledonia, who was looking for someone to do statistics and spatial ecology with her data. So no specific event, just a lot of luck.
Okay, I think we've got time for maybe two more. So Simon would like to know, would a protected area around those seamounts, the ones that you've identified, prevent so-called scientific whaling that some countries like Japan still practice?
Well, so these protected areas that I talked about would be created within the New Caledonian Economic Exclusive Zone, within the natural park of the Coral Sea. So this park covers almost all of the economic zone, and the scientific whaling does not occur within the EEZ. So in any case, I guess this is not the threat that we're trying to protect whales against. Yes, so I hope that answers the question.
So I think probably the last question we'll have time for is really just to understand what it is that you're going to do next with your research, and also the protection piece that you're talking about. What are the next steps for you?
So in terms of research, the latest stuff that we've done that I didn't have the time to tell you about today is that we conducted 4 research cruises this last winter in collaboration with other scientists who look at currents, who look at prey in the water, and we counted humpback whales, but also other cetacean species and seabirds, to really try to understand seamounts at an ecosystem scale, and understand why would whales select certain seamounts instead of others. So all of this is feeding in trying to answer the hypothesis that I've talked about these deep dives, these strange deep dives that we observed, or just generally understanding why they regroup over certain seamounts. So I'm currently analyzing this data and hoping that it will bring some answers. And I guess in terms of protection, of course, everything has been put to halt these past weeks, and we don't really know what the plan is now. But the government in New Caledonia has really committed to creating marine protected areas around seamounts. We already participated in different scientific meetings and with people from the government, and really hoping that this should be put in place in a year or so, or at least that's the goal.
What a wonderful achievement that will be, and a great
yes, it would. Yes,
yeah, for other countries around the world to see. So I think that's all we're going to have time for today, but as I did say, if your questions haven't been answered live, we're definitely going to follow up all the questions with email answers, so you will get your answers. We just want to take care of everyone's time today. So Solène, I want to say thank you so much for joining us and sharing your incredible work with us, bringing humpback whales into our living rooms, and for all of the massive effort that you and your team are making to protect them and to protect the oceans. It's really inspiring.
Thanks.
And I want to say thank you to everybody who has joined us today, all of our supporters. Thank you for everything that you do, from donating to signing petitions and writing to MPs and turning up on Parliament lawn to protect our seamounts and our oceans. This is the second Oceans Live event that we have done, and we're going to be doing a few more in the coming weeks on all different topics. So look out for those details. They will turn up in your inboxes. And in the meantime, stay safe, stay happy, and we will see you all very soon, hopefully. Ka kite.